It started like any other school day in an upscale private academy known for its exclusivity and high-profile students. But beneath the polished hallways and gleaming lockers, a story was quietly unfolding, one that would shock not only the students but the entire world. Blue Ivy Carter, the daughter of global superstar Beyoncé and music mogul Jay-Z, was just like any other student, at least in her own eyes. Despite her iconic lineage, Blue Ivy simply wanted to learn, laugh with friends, and enjoy the innocence of her childhood. But to one teacher, her presence was more than an opportunity to nurture. It became an avenue for something far darker. Ms. Hargrove, a long-tenured teacher at the academy, had a reputation that was complicated. Known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense demeanor, she was a polarizing figure among students and parents alike. While some admired her for her academic rigor, others whispered about her biases, an undertone of prejudice that rarely saw the light of accountability. Yet, no one expected her to direct her subtle but damaging attitude toward a young girl who had done nothing more than walk through the classroom door. From the first day Blue Ivy stepped into Miss Hargrove's classroom, there was a tension that was impossible to ignore. The teacher's tone, cold and clipped, carried an edge whenever she addressed her. Blue Ivy, though perceptive beyond her years, initially brushed it off as the quirks of a strict educator. But as weeks passed, the subtle slights turned into overt acts of belittlement. Miss Hargrove would nitpick her answers, ignore her raised hand, and once even mocked her handwriting in front of the class, a stark contrast to the warm encouragement she offered other students. Blue Ivy, though young, carried herself with grace, a trait undoubtedly inherited from her parents. She chose not to complain or retaliate, believing that kindness and resilience would eventually soften the teacher's heart. But Miss Hargrove's behavior only escalated. It wasn't just the microaggressions or the snide remarks. It was the way she seemed to relish in making Blue Ivy feel small, as if proving a point that had no basis in reality. Rumors began to swirl among the students. Whispers of Ms. Hargrove's comments reached the ears of classmates, some of whom grew uncomfortable with the blatant favoritism, or lack thereof, being shown. "Do you think she's doing it because of who Blue's mom is?" one student asked another during lunch. "Nah, it's probably just Miss Hargrove being her usual self," another replied, though the unease was evident in their voices. Yet, no one dared to stand up to her, afraid of becoming the next target. Things came to a head during a class presentation. Blue Ivy, having worked tirelessly on her project, stood confidently in front of the room, ready to share her ideas. But before she could even begin, Miss Hargrove interrupted, questioning her preparation and insinuating, without cause, that her work must have been done by someone else. The class fell silent, a mix of shock and discomfort rippling through the room. Blue Ivy's cheeks flushed, but she held her composure, finishing her presentation with poise. It was a moment that would later become the catalyst for what happened next. Unbeknownst to Miss Hargrove, Blue Ivy wasn't alone in her battle. She had allies who were not about to let the situation slide. Her classmates, parents who had witnessed enough, and, of course, her mother, Beyoncé. When Blue Ivy mentioned the incident at home that evening, Beyoncé listened intently, her expression a mix of heartbreak and determination. For all her fame and accolades, nothing mattered more to her than protecting her children and ensuring they grew up in an environment of love and respect. The next day, something shifted. Beyoncé decided to pay the school a visit, not as a superstar, but as a concerned mother. Her arrival was understated, but the impact was immediate. Staff members scrambled, and whispers filled the air as she calmly walked through the halls to meet with the school administration. Miss Hargrove, however, remained unaware of the storm brewing on the horizon. What happened during that meeting would later become the stuff of legend. Beyoncé, known for her eloquence and unshakable presence, addressed the issue directly, presenting not only Blue Ivy's experiences but also accounts from other students who had witnessed the teacher's behavior. The evidence was undeniable, and the administration had no choice but to take action. But the story didn't end there. Miss Hargrove, initially defensive, was called in to face not just the administration, but also the one person she least expected, Beyoncé herself. When the teacher walked into the room and saw the superstar seated across the table, her face paled, and for the first time, she was at a loss for words. It was a moment of reckoning, one that would change her life forever. And just like that, the tides began to turn. But how did the confrontation unfold? What words were exchanged that left Ms. Hargrove questioning everything she thought she knew? Stay tuned, because this story is far from over. The air in the conference room was thick with tension as Ms. Hargrove stood frozen in the doorway. She hadn't expected this. She thought the meeting would be a formality, a chance to explain herself, perhaps offer a vague apology and move on. But there, sitting calmly yet commandingly, was Beyoncé. The very woman Miss Hargrove had secretly resented was now seated across from her, not as a pop culture icon but as a mother defending her child. It wasn't just intimidating, it was humbling. Miss Hargrove hesitated before stepping in, her usual confidence slipping away. Her mind raced as she tried to recall every comment, every action she had made toward Blue Ivy. Did she truly believe no one was watching? Did she think her subtle jabs and dismissive behavior would go unnoticed? She swallowed hard, realizing she might have severely underestimated not just Blue Ivy but the entire Carter family. The school's principal, a composed yet visibly nervous man named Mr. Turner, motioned for her to take a seat. Miss Hargrove sat stiffly, her hands clasped tightly on the table. Beyoncé, on the other hand, exuded a calm strength. Her gaze was steady, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She didn't need to raise her voice to command the room. Her presence alone was enough. "I'm here," Bianca began, her voice measured, "because I need to understand why my daughter, who loves learning and always speaks highly of her teachers, has come home in tears more than once since entering your classroom." Miss Hargrove flinched slightly at the directness. This wasn't going to be a conversation she could sidestep with excuses. Beyoncé's words were not accusatory but firm, leaving no room for deflection. Mr. Turner cleared his throat, sensing the weight of the moment. "Miss Hargrove, we've received reports, not just from Mrs. Carter, but from other parents and students, about behavior in your classroom that is concerning." Concerning. That word lingered in the air, carrying implications that went beyond professionalism. Miss Hargrove, for all her faults, wasn't used to being called out. In her mind, she had convinced herself that her actions were justified, even warranted. But now, under the unwavering scrutiny of Beyoncé and the administration, her usual defenses felt flimsy. "I'm not sure I understand what's being implied," Miss Hargrove said, her voice tight. She avoided Beyoncé's eyes, focusing instead on Mr. Turner. "I've treated all my students equally, as I always have." A pause followed, heavy with unspoken truths. Beyoncé leaned forward slightly, her expression softening but not losing its edge. "Treated equally," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then perhaps you can explain why Blue feels singled out. Why she feels small in your classroom when she's anything but." The words hit like a hammer. Blue Ivy small. Miss Hargrove couldn't deny the pang of guilt that rippled through her chest. She had seen Blue's quiet confidence, her eagerness to participate, her natural curiosity. And yet, Miss Hargrove had chosen to see her as something else entirely, a symbol of privilege, a child who didn't need the same encouragement as the others. But was that true, or was it a story she told herself to justify her actions? Bianca continued, her tone never rising but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Blue is resilient. She's kind. And she believes in the goodness of people, even when they don't show it to her. But no child, deserves to feel like they're less than because of someone else's prejudice." The word prejudice hung in the air like a storm cloud. Miss Hargrove's face flushed, her pride clashing with an undeniable sense of shame. Was that what this was? Had her actions been driven by something deeper, something uglier than she cared to admit? "I'm not prejudiced," Miss Hargrove said suddenly, her voice defensive. "I've dedicated my career to educating students of all backgrounds. I've worked tirelessly to what?" Beyoncé interrupted, her voice still calm but unyielding. "To tear down a child who only wants to learn? to project your frustrations onto someone who's done nothing but exist in your classroom. Mr. Turner shifted uncomfortably, clearly struggling to maintain control of the meeting. Ms. Hargrove, this isn't about attacking you. It's about understanding what's happened and ensuring that our students feel safe and supported. Ms. Hargrove nodded slowly, though her mind was a whirlwind. She thought back to the small moments she had dismissed as insignificant. The times she had ignored Blue Ivy's hand, the sarcastic comments she had made about her work, the way she had treated her differently without fully realizing, or perhaps admitting, why. But what was it about Blue Ivy that triggered her so deeply? Was it her confidence? Her lineage? The fact that she represented a world Miss Hargrove could never touch? The truth was, Miss Hargrove had carried resentment for years. Resentment toward a society that she felt had overlooked her. Resentment toward families like the Carters who seemed to live in a bubble of untouchable privilege. And Blue Ivy, with her bright eyes and unassuming grace, had become an unintentional target. Beyoncé, ever observant, seemed to read the turmoil in Miss Hargrove's expression. "I'm not here to shame you," she said, her voice softening slightly, "but I won't let this slide. My daughter deserves better. All the children in your class deserve better." The room fell silent again, the weight of Beyoncé's words settling over everyone. Mr. Turner glanced at Ms. Hargrove, his expression expectant. "Ms. Hargrove, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Ms. Hargrove hesitated, her pride warring with the growing realization that she couldn't escape accountability. I didn't mean to make Blue feel that way," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I've been unfair, I'll make it right." Beyoncé nodded, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about making it right," she said. "It's about understanding why it happened in the first place, because if you don't address that, it won't stop." Those words struck deeper than any accusation could. Beyoncé wasn't just asking for an apology. She was demanding introspection, change, growth. And that, Ms. Hargrove realized, was far more daunting than any punishment the school might impose. As the meeting came to an uneasy close, Ms. Hargrove couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change. Beyoncé had spoken with the calm authority of someone who knew her worth, and in doing so, she had forced Ms. Hargrove to confront the uncomfortable truths she had long buried. But what would happen next? Could Ms. Hargrove truly change, or was it too late for her to unlearn the biases that had shaped her actions? And how would Blue Ivy, with her quiet strength, navigate the fallout of a confrontation she never asked for but had undoubtedly sparked? After the meeting, Ms. Hargrove walked through the school halls, her mind clouded with unease. The students bustled around her, their laughter and chatter blending into a distant hum. For the first time in her long teaching career, she felt like an outsider in her own classroom. The confidence she had once carried, the belief that she was untouchable, was gone, replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. She replayed Beyoncé's words in her head, each one carving a deeper crack in the walls she had built around her conscience. That evening, as she sat alone in her modest apartment, Miss Hargrove tried to make sense of her actions. She reached for the notebook she used to grade papers and flipped through the assignments. Blue Ivy's work was there, her neat handwriting and thoughtful answers standing out. Miss Hargrove couldn't deny the quality of the child's work. It was exceptional for her age. But why, then, had she been so quick to tear it down? In the silence of her living room, she was forced to confront something she had never admitted to herself: envy. Blue Ivy wasn't just talented. She was confident in a way Miss Hargrove had never been, even as an adult. That confidence, paired with the privilege of her family name, had awakened feelings Miss Hargrove didn't want to face. But was that really an excuse? No, it wasn't. She knew that much. Meanwhile, Blue Ivy was at home, quietly processing the events of the past few weeks. She sat on her bed, surrounded by books and the notes she had been working on for her latest project. Despite the support she received from her parents and friends, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling of being unfairly judged. Her mother's words from earlier that day echoed in her mind. Asterisk, you're strong, and you don't have to carry this alone, asterisk. But Blue couldn't help wondering why she had to carry it at all. She loved school. She loved learning. Why couldn't Miss Hargrove see that? Why did she feel the need to make Blue feel small? These were questions that didn't have easy answers, and for a girl as thoughtful as Blue, the uncertainty was its own kind of burden. Jay-Z, watching his daughter from the doorway, stepped into the room and sat beside her. "You know," he said, his voice calm and steady, "people like Miss Hargrove don't define you. They don't get to decide who you are or what you're worth." Blue looked up at her father, her big eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "But why does she hate me, Dad? I didn't do anything to her." Jay-Z sighed, running a hand over his face. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "people carry their own pain and insecurities, and instead of dealing with them, they take it out on others. It's not about you, Blue. It's about her." That explanation brought some comfort, but it didn't erase the hurt. Blue nodded slowly, determined not to let Miss Hargrove's actions change who she was. Still, the experience had left a mark, a subtle but undeniable shadow on her otherwise bright world. Back at school, the students were buzzing about what had happened. Word spread quickly that Beyoncé had confronted Miss Hargrove, and it didn't take long for the rumors to start. Some students defended the teacher, saying she was strict but fair. Others, however, began sharing their own experiences, moments when they had felt unfairly treated or ignored in her classroom. One student, a quiet boy named Marcus, spoke up during lunch. "You know," he said to his friends, "Miss Hargrove always calls on the same kids, the ones she thinks are good enough. She barely even looks at me when I try to answer." Another girl chimed in, "Yeah, and remember when she made fun of how I pronounced that word last year? She said it in front of everyone like it was a joke." The stories began to pile up, and soon, the students realized that Blue Ivy wasn't the only one who had been affected. Miss Hargrove's behavior, while subtle, had created an environment where certain students felt invisible, or worse, unwelcome. The school administration, now aware of the growing discontent, launched an internal investigation. Parents began coming forward, sharing concerns they had previously kept quiet. For years, Miss Hargrove's reputation had shielded her from scrutiny, but now, the cracks were impossible to ignore. For Beyoncé, the issue wasn't just about Blue Ivy, it was about the larger picture. She knew this wasn't an isolated incident. How many other children had been made to feel less than? How many parents had stayed silent, thinking they wouldn't be taken seriously? This wasn't just a fight for her daughter. It was a fight for every child who had ever been treated unfairly by someone in a position of power. One evening, as Beyoncé sat with her team, she considered how best to approach the situation. She didn't want to escalate the conflict unnecessarily, but she also couldn't let it fade into the background. Her platform was massive, and with it came a responsibility. But how could she use her voice without overshadowing the very people she was trying to help? At the same time, Miss Hargrove was grappling with her own inner conflict. The complaints against her were piling up, and she knew she was on thin ice. For the first time, she began to question everything: her teaching methods, her biases, even her reasons for becoming a teacher in the first place. She thought back to when she first started, when she was young and idealistic, full of passion for education. Where had that passion gone? And more importantly, could she ever get it back? The tension in the school grew with each passing day. The students watched closely, wondering what would happen next. Some whispered that Miss Hargrove would be fired. Others speculated that she might apologize and try to make things right. But no one, not even Miss Hargrove herself, knew what the future held. As for Blue Ivy, she chose to focus on what she could control: her studies, her friendships, and her own sense of self. She knew her parents had her back, and that knowledge gave her strength. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder: could Miss Hargrove ever see her for who she really was? Could she ever see beyond the name, beyond the fame, and recognize the simple truth? That Blue Ivy was just a girl who loved to learn, who wanted to be seen, and who deserved respect like anyone else. The story was far from over, and the resolution remained uncertain. But one thing was clear: the events unfolding at the school were a turning point for Blue Ivy, for Miss Hargrove, and for everyone who had ever felt the sting of being underestimated. The days that followed felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. The air in the school was thick with tension, and everyone, students, staff, and parents, seemed to be holding their breath. Whispers filled the hallways, every conversation tinged with curiosity or speculation about what would happen next. Miss Hargrove carried herself as though everything was fine, but the cracks in her facade were impossible to miss. Her normally sharp tone was softer, her confident strides slower. The weight of scrutiny was finally catching up with her. Blue Ivy noticed the change too. Miss Hargrove didn't call on her in class anymore, not even to deliver the barbs Blue had grown used to. But the silence felt just as heavy. It was as though the teacher had erased her altogether, pretending she wasn't even there. Blue tried to focus on her studies, but the situation gnawed at her. She didn't want pity from her classmates or avoidance from her teacher. She just wanted fairness, respect, and the chance to learn like everyone else. At home, Beyoncé and Jay-Z discussed their next steps late into the night. The investigation was underway, and the administration had promised to take action. But Beyoncé wasn't satisfied with waiting. She knew from experience that systems like these often dragged their feet, hoping the noise would die down on its own. She wasn't about to let that happen. This wasn't just about Blue, it was about the other children who didn't have the same kind of platform to speak out. "I'm thinking of hosting a meeting with the parents," Beyoncé said to Jay-Z one evening, her voice steady but determined. "We need to come together and make sure this isn't swept under the rug." Jay-Z nodded, leaning back in his chair. "You know it's going to stir up even more attention. Are you ready for that?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm ready. I'm tired of seeing people like Miss Hargrove hiding behind their roles. If we don't speak up now, when will we?" The next day, Beyoncé quietly reached out to a group of parents she knew shared her concerns. The meeting was scheduled for the weekend, and by the time Saturday arrived, word had spread farther than she expected. What began as a small gathering turned into a packed room. Parents, alumni, and even a few current students came, all eager to share their experiences and stand in solidarity with Blue Ivy and the others who had faced similar treatment. As the meeting began, Beyoncé stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding yet warm. She spoke candidly about Blue's experience, careful not to vilify Ms. Hargrove but firm in her message. The system needed to change. One by one, parents began to share their stories. Some spoke of incidents with Ms. Hargrove, while others discussed broader issues within the school. A pattern emerged. Students who didn't fit Ms. Hargrove's idea of worthy often found themselves sidelined or diminished. One father recounted how his son, who excelled in math, had been told he wasn't cut out for advanced classes. Another mother tearfully described how her daughter had started dreading school after being repeatedly humiliated in class. The stories painted a damning picture, and the tension in the room grew as more voices joined in. Beyoncé listened intently, her hands folded in front of her, nodding at each person who spoke. It was clear this wasn't just about Blue Ivy. This was a deeper, systemic issue that had gone unchecked for far too long. Meanwhile, at the school, Ms. Hargrove was beginning to feel the walls closing in. The administration had called her in for multiple meetings, each one more uncomfortable than the last. She could feel the disapproval radiating from her colleagues, who were now keeping their distance. She tried to justify her actions, telling herself she had only been doing her job. But even she couldn't fully believe that anymore. The principal's words from their last meeting echoed in her mind. "This isn't just about one incident, Miss Hargrove. It's a pattern, and it's one we can't ignore." She knew her time was running out, but she didn't know what to do. Apologizing felt hollow. What could she possibly say to erase the damage she'd done? And even if she wanted to change, would anyone believe her? The tension reached a boiling point the following Monday. The school announced a special assembly for the upper grades, citing an important message about the values of respect and inclusivity. The students filed into the auditorium, their conversations hushed and curious. Blue Ivy sat with her friends near the middle, her heart pounding as she glanced toward the front of the room. Miss Hargrove was there, sitting off to the side, her face pale and unreadable. She seemed smaller than usual, her sharp edges dulled by the weight of the moment. Beside her stood Mr. Turner, the principal, who took the microphone and began to speak. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We've called this assembly because we believe it's important to address some concerns that have come to our attention. This school prides itself on being a place where every student feels valued, respected, and supported. But recently, it's become clear that we haven't always lived up to that standard." The students listened intently, some exchanging glances while others sat still, their expressions serious. Blue Ivy felt her pulse quicken as Mr. Turner's words hung in the air. "This isn't about singling anyone out," he continued, "but about acknowledging that we have work to do together. To that end, we've decided to take immediate steps to ensure that every student here feels safe and respected. This includes additional training for our staff, as well as creating new channels for students to share their concerns." The announcement was met with polite applause, but the energy in the room remained tense. Everyone was waiting for the moment they felt was inevitable, the moment Ms. Hargrove would have to face the consequences of her actions. As the assembly ended and the students filed out, the whispers began again. Was Ms. Hargrove going to resign? Would she apologize? And what would happen to the students who had been affected by her behavior? Blue Ivy stayed behind for a moment, watching as Ms. Hargrove lingered near the front of the auditorium. Their eyes met briefly, and for the first time, Blue saw something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. It was fleeting, but it was there, a crack in the armor Ms. Hargrove had worn so tightly for so long. The tension was palpable, and everyone could feel it. The moment of reckoning was near. But what would it look like? Would justice be served? Or would the cycle continue, leaving the real issues unresolved? No one knew for sure, but one thing was certain: the next step would define everything. As the day unfolded, the tension surrounding Ms. Hargrove didn't dissipate. Instead, it seemed to grow heavier. Students exchanged glances and whispered in corners, and even the teachers appeared on edge, their usual chatter subdued. Blue Ivy moved through the halls quietly, her friends flanking her as if forming an invisible barrier of support. Despite the assembly's attempt to address the issue, it felt like everyone was waiting for something bigger to happen, something no one could quite predict. What Blue didn't know was that the wheels of change were already in motion, but not in the way anyone expected. Late that afternoon, an email began circulating among the parents. It came from a former student who had heard about the recent events through social media. The message was long but precise, recounting a similar experience with Ms. Hargrove years earlier. This student, now in college, described how they had been ridiculed for their creative approach to a project, dismissed as too ambitious for their age. The email was accompanied by a string of replies from others who had similar stories to share, alumni who had carried their own quiet frustrations for years. By the time the email reached Beyoncé's inbox, it had become a sprawling thread of grievances. What began as an isolated incident with Blue Ivy had unearthed something far larger: a history of students feeling belittled, overlooked, or outright bullied. Beyoncé stared at the email on her screen, her chest tightening with a mix of anger and determination. It wasn't just Blue. It never had been. This wasn't a personal vendetta. It was a pattern of behavior that had hurt countless children over the years. She forwarded the email to Jay-Z, adding only 2 words: asterisk, "It's time," asterisk. That evening, the Carter household buzzed with activity. Beyoncé and Jay-Z, along with a trusted team of advisors, began strategizing. They didn't want to publicly shame Ms. Hargrove, but they also knew they couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. This was about accountability, about ensuring no other child had to endure what Blue, and so many others, had experienced. The following day, as the school tried to carry on as usual, an unexpected visitor arrived. It was Mr. Daniels, a member of the school district's board, who had been called in to assess the situation. His presence sent shockwaves through the faculty, and the rumor mill churned even faster. Students whispered about what it could mean, and teachers exchanged uneasy glances. For Ms. Hargrove, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was beginning to crumble. During her meeting with Mr. Daniels, Ms. Hargrove maintained a calm exterior, but inside, she was unraveling. He asked direct questions, his tone neutral but unyielding. Had she ever singled out students unfairly? Were her grading practices consistent? Were there instances of inappropriate comments or actions? Miss Hargrove answered carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who knew every sentence would be scrutinized. But no matter how she framed her responses, the truth was impossible to deny. The evidence was piling up, and her explanations were growing thinner by the moment. At the same time, Blue Ivy found herself at the center of a storm she never asked for. Her classmates were supportive, but their constant questions, "Are you okay? What's going to happen?" felt overwhelming. She retreated to the library during lunch, hoping for a moment of peace. But as she sat at a corner table, flipping through a book without really reading it, someone approached her. It was Marcus, the quiet boy from her class who rarely spoke up. He hesitated for a moment before sitting across from her. "Hey," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thanks." Blue looked up, confused. "For what?" "For standing up," Marcus replied. "Even if you didn't mean to. You make people listen. A lot of us, we've been dealing with this for years, but no one ever cared. Because we're not, important." Blue frowned. "That's not true," she said firmly. "You're important. Everyone is." Marcus gave her a small, sad smile. "Maybe, but it doesn't feel that way when someone like Ms. Hargrove decides you're not worth her time." His words stuck with her long after he walked away. It wasn't just about her. It was about every kid who had been made to feel invisible, unworthy, or small. And now she realized she had a responsibility to do more than just endure. She had to make sure their voices were heard too. As the school day ended, a new twist emerged, one no one saw coming. An anonymous letter was sent to the local press, detailing the growing controversy at the school. It described the assembly, the parent meeting, and even hinted at the email chain that had been circulating. The story quickly gained traction, and within hours, reporters were calling the school, demanding comments from the administration. The attention added a new layer of chaos. Parents were furious that the issue had spilled into the public eye, and the school board was scrambling to contain the situation. Miss Hargrove, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in even further. She had spent years building her reputation, and now it was unraveling at lightning speed. But the most shocking revelation came later that evening when another email surfaced, this time from a fellow teacher. It was a quiet confession, sent only to the administration but quickly leaked among the staff. The teacher admitted to witnessing Ms. Hargrove's behavior over the years and staying silent out of fear of retaliation. "I should have spoken up," the email read. "But I didn't. And for that, I'm sorry." The confession sent shockwaves through the school. It was no longer just student accounts or parental concerns. Now, one of their own had stepped forward, validating the stories that had been dismissed for so long. For Ms. Hargrove, it was the final blow. She could feel the ground beneath her slipping away entirely. As the sun set that evening, the school community was left in a state of suspense, unsure of what the next day would bring. For Blue Ivy, the journey had become about more than just her own experience. She was standing at the center of a movement she hadn't meant to start, but one she now felt deeply connected to. And for Ms. Hargrove, the question lingered. Was there any way to salvage what remained of her career, or was it already too late? The morning began with an air of inevitability hanging over the school. By now, the entire community was aware of the turmoil surrounding Ms. Hargrove. The previous night's leaked email had reached parents, students, and even local media outlets, creating a wave of speculation about what would happen next. Despite the tension, classes proceeded as usual, though it was clear no one was focused on their lessons. All eyes were on Ms. Hargrove, who entered the classroom with a stiff posture, her usual confidence nowhere to be seen. Blue Ivy sat at her desk, watching as her teacher avoided eye contact with everyone. There was no sarcasm in her tone, no critical comments. She taught the lesson as though on autopilot, her voice monotone and mechanical. It was unsettling in its own way, but it gave Blue a sense of closure. For once, the woman who had made her feel small seemed to understand the weight of her actions, or at least the consequences. Just before lunch, an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Attention, staff and students," the principal's voice said, unusually formal. "All teachers, Please escort your students to the auditorium for an important assembly." The murmur of curiosity rippled through the hallways as students and teachers filed into the auditorium. The air was electric, buzzing with anticipation and uncertainty. When everyone was seated, Mr. Turner stepped onto the stage, his expression serious. Behind him, members of the school board, including Mr. Daniels, sat in a somber line. Mr. Turner began to speak, his voice calm but resolute. "Today, we're here to address the concerns that have come to light over the past weeks. As a school, it's our responsibility to foster an environment of respect, fairness, and inclusion for every student. Unfortunately, it's clear that we've fallen short of that standard." The room was silent as he continued, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. "After a thorough investigation, we have determined that certain behaviors and practices within our school have not aligned with our values. Effective immediately, Ms. Hargrove will be placed on administrative leave." Gasps echoed throughout the auditorium, followed by a wave of whispers. Ms. Hargrove, seated near the back, didn't flinch. Her expression was blank, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This decision was not made lightly," Mr. Turner added, "but it's one we believe is necessary to begin rebuilding trust within our community. Moving forward, we are committed to creating a more inclusive and supportive environment for all students and staff." As the assembly ended and students began to file out, there was a sense of resolution in the air, but it wasn't complete. For Blue Ivy, it felt like the end of a chapter, but not the whole story. She knew that while Ms. Hargrove's leave was a step in the right direction, it didn't erase the pain she and others had experienced. It didn't ensure the system would change, and it didn't guarantee this wouldn't happen again. Later that evening, Beyoncé and Jay-Z sat down with Blue to talk about everything that had unfolded. "You know," Beyoncé said, her voice gentle, "this isn't just about one teacher. What you did, speaking up, staying strong, that's going to help so many kids who felt like they didn't have a voice." Blue nodded, but her expression was serious. "I just don't want it to stop here," she said quietly. "What about the other kids who don't have someone to stand up for them? What happens to them?" Her words stayed with Beyoncé long after Blue went to bed. She realized Blue was right. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The following week, Beyoncé announced the creation of a new initiative, a program designed to support schools in fostering inclusivity and fairness, providing resources for teachers, students, and parents alike. It was a bold move, one that garnered both praise and criticism. But for the Carters, it was a way to turn pain into purpose, ensuring that Blue Ivy's experience could lead to meaningful change. Just when it seemed like the dust was settling, a new twist emerged. An anonymous letter appeared in the school's inbox, addressed to Mr. Turner and the school board. It contained detailed accounts of Ms. Hargrove's interactions with students, spanning years, but it wasn't written by a former student or a parent. It was written by Ms. Hargrove herself. In the letter, she confessed of her behavior, acknowledging the harm she had caused and taking responsibility for her actions. She admitted that her treatment of certain students stemmed from her own insecurities and biases, things she had never dealt with but could no longer ignore. The letter ended with an apology, not just to the students and families she had wronged, but to herself, for allowing her own fears to control her actions. The revelation shocked everyone. It was a moment of vulnerability no one had expected, and it shifted the narrative in a way that felt almost redemptive. For Blue Ivy, it was a reminder that even those who seem unmovable can change when confronted with the truth. In the end, the story wasn't just about a teacher, a student, or even a school. It was about the power of standing up for what's right, of using your voice to create change, and of realizing that sometimes, even the smallest actions can lead to something extraordinary. And as Blue Ivy walked into school the next day, she did so with her head held high, knowing she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who would come after her.